Beneath the ashes of a war long ended, there remain fragments no nation dares admit exist. Sealed vaults, erased maps, voices silenced before they could testify. These are the hidden corridors of history, where truth was buried under layers of secrecy and fear. Imagine doors locked so tightly that even time cannot pry them open, and behind them, shadows whisper of weapons, alliances, and betrayals meant never to be seen. What we glimpse now are only cracks in the blackout curtain. The last weeks of the Third Reich were defined by chaos. In the smoldering ruins of Berlin, the regime was unraveling. Hitler remained in the Führerbunker, issuing impossible orders to divisions that no longer existed, while Grand Admiral Karl Donitz attempted to preserve what remained of the Kriegsmarine. It was in this context, during the second week of April 1945, that a covert naval order was drafted under the designation Unternehmen Nebel, Operation Fog. The order called for the departure of a small group of Type WWII and IXD-2 U-boats from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, carrying cargoes that did not appear on standard naval manifests. The boats were bound for neutral ports in South America, chiefly Buenos Aires and Montevideo, with the ultimate objective of establishing escape routes for high-ranking officials and securing Reich assets beyond Europe. Archival fragments suggest at least 4 vessels were involved: U-530, U-977, U-1235, and an unidentified fourth, possibly a modified IXD-2 long-range submarine. Their official war diaries, Kriegstagebücher, are missing or heavily censored, replaced in the Bundesarchive by blank sheets marked Kriegsverlust. Testimony gathered in 1946 during Allied interrogations of captured U-boat crews suggests that special cargo was loaded onto these submarines in late March, including sealed steel containers marked with Reichsbank seals, laboratory equipment, and individuals under SS guard. Witnesses mentioned the presence of officers in plain uniforms, identified only by initials or cover names, who embarked just before the vessels departed. Allied patrols in the North Atlantic noted anomalies. On 9th April 1945, HMS Ventura, the Royal Navy's most celebrated submarine after its sinking of U-864, recorded sonar contacts northwest of the Azores. Declassified reports mention pursuit of 2 submerged contacts moving in tight formation, an unusual tactic for U-boats trained to operate alone. The official Admiralty log states that Ventura engaged but was unable to confirm kills due to poor sonar conditions. Curiously, the entire section of the logbook covering the night of 9 to 10th April was removed during post-war archival transfers, replaced by a notation in red pencil. Record transferred to cabinet file, closed until 2045. Meanwhile, intercepted Enigma traffic from Kiel in early April contained repeated references to Sonderboote, special boats. Bletchley Park decrypts reveal that these signals were marked with the highest level of secrecy, employing the rarely used Kriegsmarine officer cipher. The decrypts ended abruptly on 23rd April, coinciding with the collapse of German naval command structures. After this date, no further references to Unternehmen Nebel appear in surviving records. What became of the convoy remains the subject of speculation. U-530 surrendered in Mar del Plata, Argentina, on 10th July 1945, 2 months after the German surrender. The crew, led by Oberleutnant Otto Vermuth, claimed to have scuttled secret documents and materials off the coast before turning themselves in. Their unusually well-fed condition, and the fact that the boat carried no standard provisions for a transatlantic voyage, raised suspicions among US naval intelligence. During interrogation, several sailors mentioned stopping at an island base in the South Atlantic, possibly Tristan da Cunha, or a secret anchorage near the coast of Brazil. Their statements were dismissed as deliberate deception. U-977 followed weeks later, surrendering in Mar del Plata on 17th August 1945 after a 66-day submerged passage. Its commander, Heinz Schäfer, later published an account of the voyage, but his memoir conspicuously avoids details of the boat's activities prior to reaching Argentine waters. In both cases, Argentine intelligence quickly classified its reports, forwarding copies to Perón's government in Buenos Aires. Files released decades later confirm the presence of German nationals arriving in Argentina during the same summer, some using falsified Red Cross passports issued in Genoa. The other two vessels were never recovered. U-1235 was reported sunk by USS Stanton on 15 April 1945 in the North Atlantic, yet the wreck has never been located despite multiple sonar surveys. Naval researchers have pointed out inconsistencies in the engagement report, particularly regarding the number of depth charges expended versus the size of the debris field recorded. As for the unidentified fourth vessel, no trace exists in post-war archives, leading some historians to argue that at least one of the Unternehmen naval submarines completed its mission. In Buenos Aires, rumors circulated in 1947 of German officers attending receptions under assumed identities, their accents unmistakably Prussian or Austrian. Argentine police files mention investigations into gatherings at the Club Alemán, where unfamiliar individuals were seen meeting with industrialists connected to the Perón regime. None of these men were ever officially identified. In 1950, the CIA reported that a Dr. Keller, formerly attached to the Reich's chemical weapons program, was residing in Córdoba province, though no arrest followed. The cargo of the forgotten convoy has been the subject of endless speculation. Some sources argue it consisted of Reichsbank gold intended to finance exile networks like Odessa. Others point to testimonies mentioning sealed cylinders, guarded by SS officers, possibly biological samples or advanced weapons research, from Peenemünde. A 1946 US Navy intelligence memo noted that scientific personnel of unusual background may have been among those transported, suggesting an early transfer of expertise later associated with Operation Paperclip. The truth remains elusive. Today, maritime historians continue to search for the missing submarines. Expeditions off the Azores and the Brazilian coast have identified dozens of wrecks, but none conclusively linked to Unternehmen Naval. The surviving documents remain fragmentary, scattered across British Admiralty archives, US naval intelligence files, and sealed Argentine dossiers. What is certain is that in the final weeks of the war, as the Reich collapsed, a handful of submarines slipped into the Atlantic carrying secrets that never resurfaced. Their voyage, unacknowledged, erased, but whispered about in naval intelligence circles, remains one of the most enduring enigmas of World War II. Among the tens of thousands of Allied documents declassified in the early 1980s, a thin folder surfaced in the US National Archives marked only OSS post-war seizures. Inside were two blurred carbon copies of memoranda referencing a mission called Operation Harpocrates. Named after the Greek god of silence, the operation had no official entry in the Office of Strategic Services European Command reports, nor was it mentioned in the standard post-war occupation logs. What little is known comes from fragments, redacted cables, after-action summaries stripped of names, and a handful of photographs that never reached the press. The mission began in June 1946, more than a year after Germany's unconditional surrender. While the Allied Control Council was still dismantling Nazi ministries, British and American intelligence received reports of sealed mine shafts near Halberstadt in the Harz Mountains. The mines had been used during the war to conceal looted art and technical archives. Soviet forces had already stripped much of the region in late April 1945, but unexplained activity was noted by locals in the months that followed. Guarded convoys, arriving at night, explosions muffled deep underground, and shipments of timber used to reinforce tunnels. By early 1946, the OSS suspected that something had been overlooked or deliberately hidden. The operation was authorized under direct joint order from Major General William Donovan's successor in OSS Research and Analysis, and Brigadier Kenneth Strong of British Intelligence Division. It was designated as a post-conflict seizure of scientific archives. But the operational papers were filed under the deliberately misleading label Timber Survey. A team of 24 men, a mix of OSS officers, Royal Engineers, and Civilian specialists from the British Scientific Intelligence Section, SIS, was assembled in Kassel under strict secrecy. They travelled in unmarked trucks, armed with demolition gear and Geiger counters, carrying sealed orders that forbade local Allied commanders from interfering. The shaft targeted was known locally as the Langenstein Mine, a subsidiary of the larger Mittelwerk complex, where the V-2 rockets had been assembled. Records show the Soviets had secured Mittelwerk in April 1945, taking most of the engineers east, but aerial reconnaissance revealed that Langenstein's western tunnels had not collapsed. On 14 June 1946, Operation Harpocrates entered the site. According to a heavily redacted British after-action report, the men discovered approximately 70 sealed containers, dimensions 1.5 by 0.5 of military technical relevance. The containers were transported under armed escort to a temporary holding facility at Nordhausen, where their contents were inventoried. Surviving photographs depict crates filled with files, bound volumes stamped with Reichsadler insignia, and reels of magnetic tape. A later OSS memorandum describes neurological experimentation records exposing POW subjects to electroconvulsive induction and frequency emissions. Other crates contained plans for experimental radio wave transmission devices, designs allegedly connected to research initiated at Peenemünde. The documents referred to test facilities codenamed Sturmvogel and Donnerschlag, though no Allied investigation has confirmed their physical existence. What happened next remains shrouded in silence. Several of the scientists brought to evaluate the material, including Dr. Alistair Powell of the British Admiralty's Signals Division and Lieutenant Colonel Thomas A. Hensley of the US Army Medical Corps, died within a year of returning to Britain. Their deaths were ruled natural causes: cerebral hemorrhages, sudden heart failure, unexplained seizures, but the clustering of fatalities was unusual. Powell's widow later recalled him suffering from strange nightmares and severe migraines in the months before his death. His personal notes, kept in a locked cabinet, were destroyed in a fire at RAF Farnborough in November 1947, an incident officially blamed on faulty wiring. The physical evidence of Operation Harpocrates was deliberately obscured. By late 1946, the crates were split between British and American custody, with some reportedly flown under military guard to Fort Detrick, Maryland, while others were dispatched to the British Porton Down Research Establishment. Yet when US Army records from Fort Detrick were reviewed in the 1970s, no accession logs from June 1946 were found. The paper trail ends abruptly after a transatlantic shipment logged as miscellaneous captured documents. In Germany, the Langenstein mine was sealed. US Army Corps of Engineers placed demolition charges at key access tunnels on 23 July 1946, collapsing the site entirely. Photographs show uniformed men wiring fuses, overseen by officers with no identifying insignia. When questioned decades later, local residents recalled deep detonations and plumes of dust, after which the entrances were buried under rubble and earth. The site was never reopened, and today lies beneath overgrown forest land, unmarked by any memorial. Soviet archives suggest they were aware of the Allied seizure. A 1947 GRU intelligence file, uncovered after the fall of the USSR, references enemy, confiscation of documents from Halberstadt district relating to experimental influence devices. The report accuses the Anglo-Americans of withholding cooperation and concludes with a warning. This knowledge may be exploited to strategic disadvantage of the Soviet Union. Whether this reflected genuine Soviet awareness or suspicion remains unclear. To this day, Operation Harpocrates is absent from official British histories. A 1952 parliamentary inquiry into secret research programs made no mention of it, despite references to paperclip and backfire. Requests for declassification in the 1990s were met with the standard response: no relevant files located. In the United States, the few surviving memos remain scattered across OSS fragment collections, often misfiled under unrelated headings. What endures are the shadows, unexplained deaths of scientists, a mine shaft erased by explosives and scattered, references to frequency induction experiments on human subjects. The operation's silence has fueled speculation for decades, but unlike the V-2 or the jet fighter, no tangible relic has ever surfaced. What was found in Langenstein, and why it was buried again, remains locked in the silence its codename foretold. By February 1945, the Wehrmacht was in its death throes. Soviet Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front was advancing rapidly through Lower Silesia, aiming for Breslau and ultimately Berlin. German resistance in the region was fragmented, composed mostly of Volkssturm militia, shattered Wehrmacht remnants, and SS units conducting desperate rearguard actions. Yet Soviet after-action reports from the same period contain references to an enemy force that did not officially exist, an armoured formation later described in Red Army communications as the Ghost Division. The first mention appears in a 3rd Guards Tank Army situation report dated 17th of February 1945. It notes unexpected engagement with enemy armoured group near Schweidnitz, Schwidnica, strength estimated at battalion level, equipped with Panther-type tanks, no unit markings observed. The Soviet report describes a night ambush against supply convoys, using well-coordinated armour and infantry assaults. Survivors claimed the German tanks carried infrared devices mounted on their turrets, technology known to be in late stage. Testing by the Waffen-SS, but not deployed in significant numbers. The Soviet document concludes tersely: identity of enemy formation unknown. Recommend classification as independent Kampfgruppe. Western intelligence learned of these reports only after 1991, when fragments of Soviet military archives were briefly opened. Cross-referencing with surviving German records produces little clarity. No authorized Wehrmacht division or corps remained intact in the Schweidnitz sector at that date. Yet eyewitness testimonies collected by Polish villagers after the war consistently speak of black uniformed tank crews operating Panthers with unusually high precision, striking swiftly and disappearing into wooded valleys before reinforcements arrived. Speculation has long centered on an SS experimental formation, known informally as SS Panzerverband Jüterbog, a training and test unit based outside Berlin. Records confirm that elements of this formation were testing the FG-1250 Zielgerät infrared system on Panther tanks as early as late 1944. These infrared scopes, mounted on the commander's cupola and linked to a handheld viewer carried by infantry, allowed limited night fighting capabilities. Historians had assumed only a handful of vehicles were equipped, yet the Soviet reports describe multiple Panthers engaging in coordinated nighttime ambushes, more than could reasonably be explained by scattered prototypes. Captured Soviet diaries provide more chilling details. One, attributed to Captain Nikolai S., a battalion commander in the 6th Guards Army, recounts a skirmish on 20th February near Strigau, Stregom. The Germans appeared suddenly like phantoms. Their tanks fired with precision from concealed positions. Our men reported beams of light sweeping across the fields, but no flares were visible. Several trucks burned before we could respond. When we counterattacked at dawn, the enemy was gone, leaving only deep tracks leading into the forest. Nikolai's unit lost 17 men and 3 vehicles in a single night raid. By early March, Soviet intelligence began referring to the unit as the Ghost Division, though the term appears only in informal communication notes and prisoner interrogations. One Soviet report claims that captured German soldiers, when questioned, spoke fearfully of an SS Schattenverband, shadow unit, under the direct authority of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. These prisoners described the unit as composed of selected veterans withdrawn from the front and re-equipped with advanced gear, operating outside normal chain of command. No such unit appears in surviving German organizational charts. The last reported engagement occurred on 2nd March 1945, when elements of the 5th Guards Mechanized Corps were attacked near Waldenburg, Wałbrzych. Soviet accounts describe phosphorus, charges igniting supply dumps, and accurate sniper fire disabling key officers. Once again, infrared equipment was noted. After this date, the reports cease. Soviet historians later classified the incidents as enemy deception operations, attributing them to scattered Kampfgruppen using captured equipment. Yet this explanation fails to account for the consistent sightings of Panthers with infrared optics, a technology supposedly never deployed in organized strength. Western intelligence analysts revisited the case during the Cold War. A 1956 CIA memorandum, now declassified, refers to Silesian encounters with Phantom SS formation, February-March 1945. The memo suggests the Ghost Division may have been tied to late-war German efforts to field a night-fighting armored battalion, possibly designated SS Panzerabteilung 153. Yet no documentation of such a battalion has ever been discovered. The CIA file concludes, no confirmation obtainable, considered probable Soviet exaggeration or deliberate disinformation. File closed. Polish accounts, however, preserve echoes of something stranger. Residents of villages near Świdnica recalled being ordered indoors by German patrols, who warned that special troops would pass through during the night. Some claimed to have seen long convoys of tanks moving without headlights, their commanders using strange viewing devices resembling binoculars mounted to their heads. In Strzegom, a farmer later described burying several burned Soviet bodies after one such raid, remarking, "The Germans came and vanished like smoke. Even the Soviets did not know who they were fighting." By the war's end in May 1945, no trace of the unit remained. No mass surrenders, no captured equipment, no surviving personnel. If the Ghost Division existed as an organized force, it was either annihilated in the final chaos or deliberately erased from records. Allied technical teams scouring Silesia in June 1945 found isolated infrared equipment abandoned in depots, but never in quantities suggesting widespread deployment. The Langenstein mine seizures in 1946, later tied to Operation Harpocrates, included references to night fighting technologies, but not to an operational SS armored group. Today, the Ghost Division remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the Eastern Front. Soviet officers swore they fought a coherent enemy unit that should not have existed. German archives offer only silence, as if the unit had been wiped from the order of battle. Historians are left with scattered Soviet reports, contradictory prisoner interrogations, and the uneasy possibility that in the war's dying months, a clandestine SS formation briefly wielded technology that blurred the line between battlefield innovation and myth. Whether a final act of desperation or a calculated experiment, the Ghost Division in Silesia has never fully emerged from the shadows into verifiable history. The end of World War II brought an uneasy alliance between former comrades in arms. The United States and the Soviet Union, once united against Hitler, quickly turned their intelligence services against one another. In the frozen expanse of Siberia, far from the bombed cities of Europe, the remnants of German science were being transplanted under Soviet control. What Western intelligence came to suspect, but never proved, was that in the late 1940s, German radar and communications specialists were working deep within Soviet territory, constructing installations that emitted signals unlike anything seen before. The story begins in September 1945, when American reconnaissance aircraft flying along the Soviet Far East border reported unusual interference with navigation equipment. Pilots of the 46th Reconnaissance Squadron described their compasses swinging wildly and radios picking up bursts of static resembling coded transmissions. These anomalies grew more frequent in 1946. By 1947, intercepted signals at US monitoring posts in Alaska included repeated bursts of high-frequency pulses that bore striking resemblance to wartime German radar signatures, particularly those of the Würzburg-Ries tracking system. It was not until 1952, however, that the CIA compiled its first full assessment of what it termed Siberian listening posts. The file, declassified only in fragments decades later, notes reports from defectors and intelligence sources inside the Soviet Union. These men spoke of entire German engineering teams relocated from Königsberg and Danzig, compelled to work. under NKVD guard on special signal installations along the Arctic coastline. One source named the project 7IJ Zvon, Northern Bell. The codename surfaced in two separate reports from unrelated informants, lending credibility to the claim. Photographic intelligence provided further evidence. Aerial reconnaissance flights from RB-29 superfortresses operating out of Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska captured images of vast antenna arrays near Tixie and Dixon Island in 1953. The installations were far larger than conventional early warning radars, arranged in geometric patterns resembling experimental wartime German blueprints. Analysts at the US Air Technical Intelligence Center compared the layouts to documents seized at Peenemünde and concluded that the Soviets appear to have absorbed advanced German concepts, possibly under coercion of captured specialists. What concerned the Americans most was not the size of the arrays, but their effect. Flight crews reported malfunctioning instruments when passing near the suspected sites. On 11th of March 1953, a US Air Force RB-50 reconnaissance aircraft nearly crashed after both compasses spun uncontrollably and altimeters froze. The official incident report blamed magnetic irregularities, but the crew privately described it as if the plane had flown into a field of invisible noise. US Navy monitoring posts in the Pacific confirmed bursts of unexplained signals on 36 MHz and 58 MHz, frequencies once used by German wartime experiments. Local Soviet records, released briefly during the 1990s, provide chilling corroboration. An internal NKVD report from Yakutsk district, dated 12 December 1949, describes the disappearance of two villages near the construction site of one such array. The file states, residents evacuated under emergency order. Those resisting were detained and transported. Remaining structures demolished to expand restricted zone. No subsequent records mention the resettled villages. Oral histories collected in the 1990s from survivors suggest entire families were taken north and never returned. By the early 1950s, the CIA grew increasingly alarmed. A 1953 memorandum to President Eisenhower, declassified in the early 2000s, warned Soviet possession of advanced German electromagnetic research presents potential for strategic disruption of navigation and communications. Installations in Arctic regions exhibit activity beyond known radar operations. Further overflight strongly advised. The same year, however, the Soviet Union shot down a US RB-29 near Vladivostok, killing all but one of the crew. Afterward, American reconnaissance overflights of Siberia became less frequent, and much of the intelligence gap remained. For decades, the existence of the Siberian listening posts was treated as Cold War rumor. Yet evidence resurfaced in 1976 when Norwegian fishermen in the Barents Sea reported strange pulsing sounds on shortwave radios. NATO signal stations recorded the same frequencies, matching those once linked to the mysterious arrays. By then, the Soviets had built the massive Duga over-the-horizon radar system near Chernobyl, the infamous Russian woodpecker. Analysts quietly noted the similarities to earlier reports of Northern Bell. Despite decades of monitoring, the exact purpose of the installations was never proven. Were they long-range detection systems adapted from German research? Were they experiments in radio wave interference, capable of disrupting Western aircraft and ships? Or were they something darker, a continuation of obscure wartime projects that sought to explore neurological effects of radio emissions on human subjects? A handful of declassified OSS fragments from Operation Harpocrates, 1946, mention neurological experiments linked to frequency emissions, hinting that the Siberian research may not have been limited to communications. The Kremlin, for its part, has always denied the existence of 7IJ Zvon. In a 1953 diplomatic exchange, Soviet officials insisted no such installations existed, dismissing American claims as propaganda. Yet intercepted transmissions, local disappearances, and anomalous aircraft malfunctions tell another story. Even today, remnants of massive antenna fields remain scattered across Siberia, abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union, their rusted, towers pointing skyward like skeletal reminders of a classified past. The Siberian listening posts remain a footnote in declassified Cold War files, overshadowed by more dramatic crises in Berlin and Cuba. But in the icy expanse beyond the Urals, where German science and Soviet ambition converged under the shadow of war's aftermath, something was built, something powerful enough to distort compasses, silence radios, and perhaps erase entire communities. Whether it was purely technological or crossed into realms of human experimentation remains unknown. What survives is only the signal, faint, irregular, but persistent, echoing across decades from the edge of the Arctic night. The collapse of Nazi-occupied Warsaw in January 1945 brought not liberation, but silence. As the Red Army pushed into the ruined city, the surviving members of the Polish resistance, the Armia Krajowa, searched desperately for evidence of atrocities committed by the Gestapo. What they found beneath the rubble of Aleja Sucha, the former Gestapo headquarters, has never been fully acknowledged in official histories. According to fragmentary testimonies, resistance fighters uncovered metal chests sealed with Reich insignia, containing files and microfilm reels unlike any other war booty. Within hours, Soviet Smersh units arrived, confiscated the material, and transported it east under armed guard. What those chests contained became known only as the Warsaw Dossiers. The earliest surviving reference to the dossiers comes from a Polish Home Army after-action report dated 22nd January 1945. The document, written in hurried shorthand and preserved in underground archives, records the discovery of 5 armored crates dimensions 120 x 80 centimeters, bearing eagle and swastika insignia and sealed with wax. Witnesses recalled resistance fighters attempting to open the crates before Soviet security forces arrived, led by an NKVD officer identified only as Major Karpov. The Poles were forced away at gunpoint. Those who resisted were arrested and never seen again. Within 48 hours, the crates had been loaded onto railcars bound for Lublin, then onward to Moscow. A second layer of evidence surfaced decades later. In 1991, after the fall of the USSR, fragments of KGB archival indices briefly became accessible to researchers. Among them was a single entry, dated February 1945. Warsaw materials received at Lubyanka. Content: dossiers on foreign collaborators, financial industrial contacts, and technical files. Classification: Osobo Ważno, most secret. The files were marked as indefinitely sealed. No subsequent Soviet or Russian archive releases have included the dossiers. What little is known of their contents comes from indirect sources. A Polish intelligence officer who defected to the West in 1954, Colonel Józef Światło, claimed in interviews that the crates contained names of prominent industrialists in Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain who secretly cooperated with the WWII. According to Światło, the files also included German plans for Project Morgenlicht, Project Morning Light, described as a post-war infiltration network designed to seed Nazi collaborators into European governments and financial institutions. Western intelligence agencies took his claims seriously, though they could never be independently verified. The idea of Project Morgenlicht aligns disturbingly with scattered German documents recovered elsewhere. A US counterintelligence Corps (CIC) report from May 1945 mentions the arrest of SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker near Munich, who carried papers referencing Morgenlicht liaison in Stockholm. No follow-up report exists, and Becker was quietly transferred to American custody before disappearing from CIC records. Whether his papers matched the Warsaw Dossiers is unknown, but the parallel references suggest a common thread: the possibility that the Soviets possessed proof of high-level collaboration between neutral nations and the Reich would have given Moscow extraordinary leverage in the post-war order. Historians have long noted Stalin's aggressive use of compromising documents. against both allies and adversaries. The Warsaw Dossiers, if they contained detailed financial and political links between Axis Germany and supposedly neutral states, would have been a weapon of enormous power. This may explain why the crates vanished into Lubyanka's vaults, never acknowledged again. Another layer of speculation surrounds alleged technical files included among the crates. A declassified MI6 briefing paper from 1948 mentions unverified reports of German research papers concerning political manipulation, propaganda techniques, and control of foreign press outlets being removed from Warsaw by Soviet forces. The report warns that such materials could be adapted for Soviet use. Some researchers suggest this knowledge fed into later Soviet active measures campaigns during the Cold War. If true, the Warsaw Dossiers were not merely records of collaboration, but blueprints for information warfare. Polish witnesses who saw the crates described them as meticulously labeled. One fighter, interviewed anonymously in 1965, recalled stenciled markings including Abteilung Ausland 2, Foreign Department 2, and RSHA WWII, divisions of the Reich Main Security Office, responsible for foreign intelligence. If accurate, this would mean the crates contained high-level Gestapo or Sicherheitsdienst files specifically concerning foreign contacts. Such records would have been invaluable in post-war intelligence struggles, enabling the Soviets to pressure, recruit, or blackmail individuals across Europe. The disappearance of the Warsaw Dossiers has haunted Polish historians for decades. The Polish government in exile in London filed repeated inquiries with the Allied Control Council in 1945 and 1946, asking whether captured Gestapo records from Warsaw had been shared. The inquiries were met with silence. In 1947, a British Foreign Office note acknowledged that certain Warsaw materials are known to be in Soviet possession, but added, requests for access have been denied. It is considered improbable that such materials will be released. Over time, the story of the dossiers faded into rumor. Some believed the crates contained evidence of war crimes committed not only by Germans, but also by collaborators within occupied Poland, material the Soviets could use to delegitimize the anti-communist resistance. Others argued the Soviets destroyed the files once their intelligence value was exhausted. Yet the single surviving KGB reference in 1991 proves that at least as of 1945, the dossiers were real, catalogued, and marked for permanent secrecy. Today, the Warsaw Dossiers remain an open wound in the history of occupied Poland. If they indeed contain names of collaborators, suppressed financial links, and plans for a Nazi post-war network, they could rewrite parts of the accepted narrative of World War II and the early Cold War. For Poland, they might also reveal why certain resistance figures were silenced in the late 1940s, targeted as fascist sympathizers by the Soviet-backed regime. Without access to the sealed files, however, the truth remains locked behind walls of classified history. In the ruins of Warsaw, resistance fighters risked their lives to unearth a secret that vanished before it could be told. Somewhere in the archives of Moscow, sealed and forgotten under layers of bureaucracy, the Warsaw Dossiers may still sit in their metal chests, silent witnesses to a hidden dimension of the war and to the shadow games that followed in its aftermath. The archives are never truly empty. They breathe, waiting for someone reckless enough to open them. Between the blank pages and the missing files lies a silence heavier than confession, a silence designed to outlast generations. Yet whispers persist, crossing borders like ghosts, reminding us that secrets buried in war do not stay buried forever. They wait in the dark, patient and unrelenting, daring us to ask whether the truth is worth the price of uncovering it.